thank you so much, everyone, for coming to the launch event of the Global Green New Deal, Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal. My name is Dalia Gebrial, and I, alongside Harpreet Paul, am a curator of the book. And also I am a writer, a researcher interested in work, climate justice and racial justice. So Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal is an illustrated book and accompanying website that responds to the growing popularity of Green New Deals in the global north with an internationalist decolonial lens. So promises of a Green New Deal have really captured the imagination of the past few years of climate activists, scholars, and policymakers across Europe and North America. And the framing, to an extent, represents a shift in thinking in the global north about climate change, which has traditionally abstracted the environment from social, economic, and political power, and instead is combining that struggle against climate breakdown with the fight for economic and social justice. And in doing so, that Green New Deal framing sort of catches the global north up with much of the rest of the world in understanding climate breakdown as a product of capitalism and recognizing the necessity of pathways out of climate breakdown as being holistic and transformative. So Harpreet and I decided to take this opportunity to put together contributions from incredible thinkers, activists, and researchers from around the world to grapple with how a Green New Deal, if it would even be called that, could work on a global level. The question is, how can we think beyond the boundaries of national politics and avoid reproducing the colonial patterns that led us here? So this project was originally supposed to be a short pamphlet completed in time for COP26 happening last year, which obviously did not end up happening. And after getting the okay from the funders at Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, Harpreet and I emailed about 30 or so of people whose work we really admired and who we would be able to speak on to these questions. So we went for our sort of dream pie in the sky list, thinking, okay, half of these people are going to get back to us and say yes, and then half of those people will actually have the time to submit something. Well, everyone replied, which wasn't meant to happen. And everyone submitted the most incredible and thoughtful pieces. So slowly but surely, it became a bigger pamphlet, then it became a booklet, and then we gave in and it became a book. We got amazing illustrations from Tomekah George and Molly CRABAPPLE, whose work really brings the words to life. And now we have an accidental but amazing illustrated book available for free to all who want it. So what the story of the book coming together tells me is that movements around the world were really ready to talk about this issue and saw the necessity of this contribution in this particular moment. And that is shown in the fact that every person that we reached out to made their time in their very busy schedules to contribute. We saw that it needed serious time and space. And we very much hope that this book and its accompanying website, which you can find at www.global-gnd.com, where you can read the book and order free copies, will trigger much more work on these issues that are raised. And we also have some really exciting plans in the pipeline for future content with our contributors, which you will all be notified about as attendees of the event later on in the year. So without further ado, let's get on with the launch. The event hashtag is #GlobalGND if you want to tweet your thoughts about it. Before I hand over to our amazing speakers, I'd just like to hand over to RLS, without whom this book was not possible, for a few words.
Thanks so much, Dalia. Really exciting to be here. So now my name is Deborah Hermans. I am a project manager at the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung London office. And yeah, have been waiting for this day to come and really glad it's here. I'll keep this extremely brief because I know we all really want to hear from the amazing panel. So yeah, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, for those of you who don't know, is a German left-wing political foundation. We're an international organization supporting political education and left actors worldwide with almost 30 offices across the world. and internationalism is at the heart of everything we do, which is why when Dalia came to me a bit over a year ago with the idea for this book, I was extremely excited and really glad to get involved and sort of help make this happen. And yeah, I just really want to say a really big thanks to Dalia and Harpreet, who over the past year have put countless hours into this book and have done an amazing job. And also to all the contributors and also to The Leap for co-publishing the book. And yeah, I wish you all a really great event, and do download the book and order your free copy if you prefer reading it in real life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Debs. And just to reiterate again, thanks for RLS and also for The Leap, who have done, without whom this book, this website simply would not be possible. So we will now hear from our speakers, who I'll introduce one by one. They'll each give about 5 to 7 minutes of opening remarks. And then hopefully we will have around 30 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have questions, please post your questions in the chat, and we will pick them up and put them forward to our speakers at the end. So our first speaker is my co-curator, Harpreet Paul. She, as well as curating this book with me, she's also a PhD researcher at the University of Warwick, where her research focuses on climate justice for loss and damage. She's previously worked at Global Policy Forum, Amnesty International, Redress, People and Planet, and Electronics Watch. She was lead author for a recent Action Aid report on market mechanisms for loss and damage in climate finance and how that has failed human rights tests, and a lead contributor to the Civil Society Review report on Can Climate Change Fueled Loss and Damage Ever Be Fair? She tweets at Harpreet K. Paul, and she is here now. Take it away, Harpreet.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We are facing a changed climate and COVID-19 together, but within that togetherness, there are differences that highlight deep historical and continuing injustices. And it's really how these injustices are interconnected that has inspired this publication. We understand that solutions need to be systemic and independent. If we look beneath the screens or the phones or the tablets or the computers that we're using to be here today, we would see the minerals and components that were mined and made across continents, many hands working in precarious contexts that are implicated by racialized notions of whose lives serve and whose consume, with histories of colonialism and slavery that persist through trade policies that maintain and build on these legacies. These inequalities of who makes goods and who consumes them will continue to persist in green infrastructure if we don't demand systems change. If we take a deep breath now and breathe in the air across our various time zones, our lungs are full of the benefit of oxygen in our atmosphere gifted from territories protected predominantly by indigenous and tribal communities who collectively and globally have protected about 80% of our remaining biodiversity in militarized and violent contexts. Between 1850 and 2002, countries in the global north emitted 3 times as many greenhouse gas emissions as countries in the global south, where approximately 85% of the global population also resides. And disparities continue. Every year, the average person in the US, Canada, and Australia emits roughly 50 times more CO2 compared to somebody in Mozambique, a country that's been ravaged by climate harms and has seen the British Department of Trade invest in fossil fuel intensive industries. The average person in Britain emits more carbon in the first 2 weeks of a year than the average per capita emissions of somebody in Rwanda, Malawi, Ethiopia, Uganda, Madagascar, Guinea, and Burkina Faso combined. The world's richest 10% cause 52% of emissions, and they're also equipped with resources to fund quick retreats to safety and accrue roughly half the world's wealth. They live in every continent, but around half of those are in North America and the EU, roughly 1/5 in China and India. In contrast, the poorest 50% of people are responsible for just 7% of emissions, living precariously, surviving on less than $5 a day, which gives very little space to prepare for our health, climate, and other shocks. So when droughts come, when sea levels rise, when extreme weather events ravage homes that have been lovingly put together with available material and thousands of acres of ground crops and boats and other vital community infrastructures ripped apart, how do we respond? And how do we address and repair the deep injustices, and who has caused the climate crisis and who has the greatest resources to respond? We know also that LGBTQI populations have been refused support in the aftermath of disasters. People who live with disabilities and incarcerated people are often dismissed from disaster preparedness policies. Women, non-binary and trans people are forced to face compounded gender-based violence when fleeing the impacts of extreme weather events. And it's a deep conviction that in order to address our climate crisis, we need to address the fundamental oppressions rooted in capitalism, racism, patriarchy, and more, and is in the tradition of the 1991 multinational People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit's Principles of Environmental Justice, and in the spirit of the people that have taken to streets resisting privatization of water, and in Seattle, against the institutions that continue the legacies of inequality today, that have to do so much in framing climate injustice that this publication builds on. And I'll hand back to Dalia.
Thank you so much, Harpreet. And just to remind everyone that if while the speakers are talking, you come up with questions or thoughts, don't hesitate to post them in the chat, and we will try and collate them at the end of the towards the end of the when the speakers have finished their opening remarks. So up next we have Dr. Jale Samwai, who is the Economic Justice Lead at Oxfam in the Pacific. He holds a PhD in climate change from the University of the South Pacific, where his thesis explored the issue of climate finance in the region. As well as contributing to a wide range of academic journals, his work has appeared in outlets such as Al Jazeera English, and he is also a contributor to Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal. He tweets at Samuwai Jale. So take it away, Jale.
Mula Dalia, thank you, Mula everybody. Greetings from the Pacific. First of all, I just want to thank the organizers for having me here. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to share this space with brilliant young minds who are leaders in their own right, and also to be given a chance to contribute a Pacific perspective to this concept of the Global Green New Deal. The idea, while some might consider bold, ambitious, it is a necessity, particularly for us here in the Pacific, given the twin global crisis of the pandemic and climate change that we are facing, that threatens the very survival of our people. And to my fellow Fijians and Pacific Islanders, I occupy this space not as a person who claimed that he has the solution to the problems that we are currently going through, but as a concerned young person that have been afforded the privilege and the means of where I work and by the educational processes that I have gone through to share ideas and hopefully provoke thinking regarding where we are right now as a country and as a region in light of the two looming disasters that we are currently facing, and to provoke thinking and discussion on how we holistically addresses these two problems locally, but at the same time inspire the necessary behavioral and institutional change globally for an alternative way of doing development. What I want to reiterate here that the Pacific region as a whole are extremely vulnerable to disasters, and the current responses of pouring in more money to our countries to fund and chart our recovery path from these two crises does not really solve the underlying drivers of why these two disasters came to be in the first place. This approach, I believe, is just but a band-aid solution to addressing our vulnerabilities. If we really want to address the issue of our vulnerabilities, then we need to shift the conversation from a resourcing talk to that of a systemic conversation. We really need to have a serious conversation of what we mean by development. The two crises that is before us are more than just environmental or health crisis. They are at their very core development problems. That is why, for me, the concept of the Global Green New Deal is timely and of urgency because it really speaks to the root of the problem, which is that the economic model that we have considered normal for so long is flawed and exacerbates inequalities. For us in the Pacific and the majority of us in the global South, we have to understand that the neoliberal economic model that underpins our development principle has its roots in colonial ideologies. And we can see this in the type of economic thinking that have historically drove our development choices. The thinking that sidelines well-being of communities and the environment and prioritizes those of cooperation and the large extraction of large natural resources as a way to achieving economic growth. The ideology that drives this economic model, if you look at it closely, is really built around what our donors' interests are, the corporate elites, and it's not built for the people, particularly the have-nots in society. While this dominant ideology have brought us this far in terms of economic prosperity, the flip side of it is that it has also brought about large-scale and in many instances, irreversible destruction to our lands and to our ocean. It has given us this idea that it is normal for us to keep taking and taking from nature without consequences. And because this model has been the norm for so long, we have become too sensitized to the cost that it extracts for our communities and environment. COVID, in a way, is a blessing in that it has acted as a mirror for most of us. Both for those of us privileged people whose work and whose position influences the development pathways of our respective countries. We have for so long talked about big concepts such as transformational change, innovation, paradigm shift, agility, and etc. But yet, if you look around, the poor are still poor and the vulnerable are still vulnerable. And now with COVID, there is a true danger that those who are already suffering will be pushed to the extreme. And I sincerely do hope that this hype around the Global Green New Deal does not meet the same fate of its many predecessors. COVID has revealed to us our collective failure to actually do right to safeguard our environment and most importantly, protect those that are truly vulnerable and marginalized in the communities. We have failed not because what is required of us is impossible, but rather we have failed because we have failed to radically reimagine a future that is just and fair for all. But all is not lost yet. While there is time to change, it is of an essence, thus the solution that we need to chart an alternative development pathway cannot be business as usual anymore. Now than ever, we really need to have bold, transparent, and inclusive discussion on the ideologies and the various assumptions on which most of our formal governance structures and institutions that governs the thinking behind the development pathway in our respective countries. We need bold political leadership that is committed to a radical overhaul of our governance systems and institutions that are meant to protect and uphold the public good. Our leaders must have the courage to make the bold national decision, even though it makes no economic sense. We need leaders to move away from viewing everything from an economic perspective and make the decision because it is morally the right thing to do for their people. I think it's about time for our countries, especially those that are advising our leaders, to look beyond the economics of solution and consider other social aspects that are often critical but often ignored to guide the decision making. Voice is also critical. We need to ask ourselves, whose voice should we be listening to? Who should be sitting at the table but is missing from critical talks such as this that influence the quality of life of our citizens? How should we as a country, as a region, articulate ourselves? If we were to apply this critique right now in critical intervention, in regional, in international, regional and local forums, that is determinant of gender well-being, it is those of rural women, the disabled, the indigenous people, the youth, the LGBTQI communities, and the faith-based organization who are always missing. either whose voices have been muted or distorted. And this has to change if the move towards a just and fair future that we want were to have some credible resonance. It is high time, I think, that we stop talking about the vulnerable and the marginalized in society and instead start listening to them. And we must do better in listening if this whole talk of the global Green New Deal impulse were to have meaning and to be able to be carried forward. We also need radical inclusion and recognize that it's about time that we bring those marginalized voices that we have devalued and not paid attention to for so long to the core of our development solution. Because these are the very people that have the common sense solution to build, that builds from everyday experience that I believe most of our countries need right now in order to transform the development pathway. I believe the world does not need big ideas. What we need are common sense ideas. And as revealed by the pandemic, these ideas, this solution lies within our communities. It lies within our people, not expensive expatriates or consultants or international cooperation or even institutions. But this idea of looking within is not new. It's common sense. And yet the powers that be in our various countries have this obsession of looking outwards for advice to those who, to a larger extent, do not appreciate the complexity of the realities at the local level, or in most instances, devalue this local knowledge simply because it's coming from people that don't fit certain academic credentials or to some extent skin color. My final point here is the need to re-examine our education system. As we are ultimately talking development here, development, as brilliantly put by one of our leading Pacific thinkers, it is an idea that creates an image of what we want to become. Thus, the ideal place where we should be channeling our investment in trying to transform the system towards one that is fair and equitable for all should start from our educational system. For the Pacific, our educational system has so long instilled in us this notion that we have to go through this formal process, that there is an office, a white-collar job waiting for you. We train our people to think working in the office is the only way for a better life, and we devalue, for instances, those curriculums that allows them to develop and explore their talents, their passions, and artistic skills. No wonder you see a lot of disenfranchised youths coming out of our formal education system that are finding it hard to fit in life because they're finding it that what we have sold them is not real. These youths have been conditioned to think that a white-collar job or having a formal job or to work for someone is the only solution to a better livelihood, and they end up in urban squatter settlement rather than returning to their communities and actually work the resources which in the Pacific we own to better their livelihood. We need to therefore relook at our curriculums, relook at the questions that we are asking our children, and more importantly, relook at the kind of leaders that we want our children to be. For me, a famous Itauke idiom resonates for me here. If I were to say it in my language, "Indau lo veving anakau ni sengone," meaning that you can only change behavior and thinking of people when they are young. I think this is where we need to start this process of socializing this global Green New Deal. And it also speaks to a broader truth of how we could actually start and implement this idea of a global Green New Deal. It has to start with you and me. If we want to change the system, then we must first change our individual behavior. Thank you, and I'll leave it for there for now. Naka.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jale, and a reminder that you can read a bit more of his work in our book, as he is one of our contributors. So our second speaker is Tina Ngata, who is the author of Resisting Colonial Fictions and also a contributor to Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal. She is an Ngati Puru advocate working on local, national and international initiatives that highlight the role of settler colonialism in issues like climate change and waste pollution, and promotes Indigenous conservation as best practice for a globally sustainable future. She previously blogged under the Non-Plastic Maori, and her work can now be found at patreon.com/Tina Ngata, and she also tweets at Tina Ngata. So take it away, Tina.
Kia ora, tēnā koutou. Thank you very much, Dalia, and also my respects to my wana brother Jale for everything that he's just laid out before us. Like Jale, I'm from Te Moana Nui a Kiwa, our Pacific nation. It's a huge blue continent, and we are a water nation. And yes, we are vulnerable to climate change. One of the points I wanted to kind of delve a little bit deeper into, though, is that these vulnerabilities around our nations did not just happen. These vulnerabilities were built in. We were made vulnerable through a process of colonization that has happened across our blue continent in different ways. And certainly it's happened in Aotearoa as well. And colonialism and imperialism is that they are inherently dehumanizing processes. There's no way that you can carry them out. And certainly the prolific level of imperialism that's played out over the past few centuries through European empires has been a dehumanizing process, has been one that has ignored and really just stomped over the human rights of peoples around the world, has dispossessed them, has driven genocide and slavery now for hundreds of years. And so insofar as these are the foundation blocks and the infrastructural integrity of the current power system really rests within this inherently racist, dehumanizing process, that is the starting point for us to start the discussion around how we're going to get out of this, because all of the decisions that are made that frame this idea of what a global Green New Deal can be look like are always going to be influenced by the infrastructure within which those discussions are taking place. So there's no getting away from the fact that we have to look at this dehumanizing infrastructure, right? And colonialism is based upon a logic that creates a hierarchy of values of human life, let alone our environmental relations. So within this colonialist and imperialist structure, you know, you have certain races who are more valued than others. You have certain life forms that are more valued than others. That is a fundamental ideological flaw that creates the inevitability of a climate crisis. And that is what we really need to be readdressing. If we don't want to keep coming back, regardless of our intentions, if we don't want to keep coming back and repeating these problems, we need to have a look at the ideology and the power structure within which these discussions, and some of them, you know, very paternalistic discussions, even when they're talking about saving us or helping us, but they don't want to extend that discussion back to you know, the power structure, relinquishing power and relinquishing wealth. The application of colonialism and imperialism has happened through a mass transfer of wealth and resources and power. Undoing that is going to require that same thing to happen. So again, we're left with this kind of inescapable problem where those who have the ultimate authority over our decisions are also the ones who have the most privilege and power that they inherently wish to protect. So there's these ideological issues that need to be unpicked, particularly in the minds and the hearts of those who wield authority, so that they can see that their own protection of privilege is denying their children a future, as well as denying the rest of us a future as well. These ideas of self-interest and the protection of privilege are incredibly forceful when it comes to forging solutions, because they will create the barriers to the most important radical solutions that we need to be facing. Now, the other aspect to colonialism and imperialism that I want to speak to is that it's one of centralizing as well. It is a centralizing process where wealth and resources are channeled into a central space. Naturally, the economy that grows out of that is one of capitalism that, again, mimics this idea of centralizing profits to a few, usually to the disempowerment and dispossession of others. And so with this centralizing of power and wealth, it moves the intimate relationships away from the places that we're in. So those who have the most intimate relationship with the river will have the least ability to be able to respond to the needs of that river or that water source or that land source or whatever is going on environmentally. Conversely, and it's difficult to talk about all Indigenous peoples, you know, with a blanket comment, but what I can say is that, you know, overall, largely Indigenous approaches to the world and our worldviews is one that comes out of the soils and waters that we have forged these relationships on and lived with for thousands of years. We have lived on our blue continent for 4,000 years. We've been moving around it. And there's a way of knowing and being and doing that grows out of that relationship. So you can say that the ways of knowing and being and doing and the science and the wisdom and the knowledge grows out of these waters, grows out of these soils, and is carried by the people who have that most long-standing relationship that is so often interrupted through colonialism. And so it's this decentralizing of power that is pivotal to the de-imperializing and the decolonizing process in order for us to achieve, you know, long-standing change and to be able to facilitate some of that ideological shift that needs to happen for us to make our way out of this climate crisis. One of the other things that I would say, though, also is that we can't continue to talk around the issue of the protection of privilege. And this is what's happening in the larger power structures, in the houses of the United Nations, in the halls of, you know, parliaments around the world, is that they're tweaking around the edges and trying to do everything but give up the power and the privilege that they have acquired through racist, imperialist and colonial systems. And so, you know, we need to continue to hold these discussions, to hold them to account, to point out the central ideological issue that drives the economic problems, that drives the environmental problems, that drives the social justice problems, which is this idea of imperial, more often than not, European white supremacy. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to leave it there and pass it back to our hosts. Those are the main points, and just give us some more time to talk. Kia ora mai tātou.
Thank you so much, Tina. And I think that question of vulnerability as something that's not inherent but is produced really taps into that question of power and solidarity rather than charity, which is such a key intervention, I think, of this book, hopefully. So our next speaker is Avi Lewis. Avi Lewis is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, journalist, and lecturer at Rutgers University. His films include This Changes Everything and the Emmy-nominated short film, A Message from the Future with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and its sequel, A Message from the Future 2, The Years of Repair with Opal Tometi. In 2017, he co-founded and is now strategic director of The Leap, an organization launched to upend our collective response to the crises of climate, inequality, and racism. He also kindly contributed the epilogue to Perspectives on a Global Green New Deal, and he tweets at Avi Lewis.
Thank you, Dalia. Thanks to Harpreet and all the contributors and other panelists. I really appreciate coming third after some searing ideological clarity from the first two speakers. I'm honored to be part of this project, and more importantly, of course, the interconnected struggles and movements that this project embodies. I'm blessed to join you today from unceded Coast Salish territory here on the lands of the Sechelt and Squamish nations. And in fact, I want to start with a story that came out of the lands next door here in what is called British Columbia. Of course, we need to start with stories because the question of story is at the heart of this struggle. And this book is so important because it attempts to sketch the outlines of a new story, one that's liberated from the profitable lies and myths of colonial capitalism. I've been lucky to work alongside Harsha Walia, whom you'll hear from in a few minutes, in a number of struggles over many years now. And Harsha and I shared an incredible mentor and teacher with many others named Arthur Manuel, who is a leader, an organizer, an intellectual from Secwepemc territory, just inland from this Pacific coast of what's called British Columbia. I met Arthur in the 1990s. I was hosting a show on Canadian public television in those days. And in those days, in the late 90s, we were debating the lock-in of those neoliberal policies of the binding infrastructure of corporate globalization and so-called free trade that has, of course, produced all of the conditions that we're living through now, from climate breakdown to pandemic. Not produced originally, of course, but locked in those very firm policies that have exacerbated all of these intersecting crises. So one day I noticed this tiny little story in the newspaper about an indigenous leader who was intervening in a NAFTA trade tribunal, this dispute that was going on between the US and Canada over lumber exports. It was Arthur Manuel, and he was intervening on the side of the United States from British Columbia, which was weird and sort of attention grabbing, and it was a brilliant gambit. And what I learned from Arthur, and what for me speaks, and this speaks to what the Global Green New Deal is all about, was that we have to start by making the invisible visible, to put the whole truth back into the official story as a precondition for any kind of justice and for any kind of intersectional movement for justice. So Art's argument, very briefly, is that Canada was founded in a massive historic land theft. This theft is ongoing colonialism. It's a crime in progress. But the Canadian courts have repeatedly affirmed Indigenous rights and title to land and resources in Canada. The Canadian government is acting like it owns all these trees and all this lumber and all these resources that it's fighting through trade processes with the United States about. So Canada's legal obligation to Indigenous peoples, what it owes in land and resources, is a massive unfunded liability, an invisible but very real debt on the balance sheet. And you have to disclose your debts if you're going to be in negotiations to sell the proceeds of that crime. Arthur was making the invisible visible. He was making a case for the subsidy that stolen Indigenous land and resources represent, a subsidy on which the entire economy of modern day Canada rests. This is echoed throughout perspectives on a global Green New Deal in this series of this beautiful kaleidoscope of perspectives from around the world. I was struck when I was reading an earlier draft in Kavita Naidu's excellent piece on women's work in the just transition, that calculation by Oxfam that the unpaid labor of care performed by women worldwide, particularly in the South, amounts to almost $11 trillion a year in unseen, invisible, unvalued labor, in everything from carrying water to growing food to keeping children and elders safe and fed and housed. More than 3 times the value of the global tech industry. That's the annual subsidy of the unseen, unpaid, but utterly essential connective care work of women to the daily functioning of late-stage capitalism. And we can't transform the economy and society without first seeing how it actually functions, seeing where the true debts and subsidies actually lie, and valuing the true stewards of the land, the resources, and the people that live thanks to those gifts. So, yes, the Green New Deal frame has electrified the climate conversation in Europe and North America. And yes, we are finally starting to talk, even in mainstream spaces, even shifting the conversation that comes from the heights of power, about intersectional solutions to all the overlapping crises of ongoing colonialism, white supremacy, deep, gaping inequality, and of course, the climate emergency. And yes, only nation states with the capacity to issue sovereign currency have the immediate resources to execute this massive transition that is needed for, in the words of the IPCC, rapid, far-reaching, and unprecedented changes in all aspects of society. But no, not every country has that capacity. In fact, only a handful in the current constellation of nation states, only a handful of countries do. And they're the ones that built that societal wealth on the ongoing grand theft and horrific crimes of colonialism. The merciless burden of illegitimate and odious debts constrain most countries in the world from making anything like the changes required to respond to the climate catastrophe, let alone to have a global Green New Deal. And in fact, if we bring the whole story into view, the true debts are from north to south. from the rich minority, whether globally or in every country, to the poor and racialized and gendered majority of humanity. So as much as we need those mechanisms of the nation state to deploy their massive ill-gotten wealth in the service of a just transition for everyone, it can't happen if it doesn't happen globally. It just can't happen if we have like zero emissions, non-market housing, public free electrified transportation, decorporatized, defossilized local agriculture in rich countries like Canada and the US, and those transformations come at the expense of unleashing an extractive frenzy of resources, land, and labor in the rest of the world. As the pandemic has taught us, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And no matter how clear and obvious that is, we live in a moment of vaccine apartheid, where the same dynamics are playing out around global justice, and the same global vulnerabilities exist because the rich are taking care of themselves first and at the expense of everybody else. No one is safe until everyone is safe, and that safety requires rebalancing the scales of justice. It means tremendous reparations, wealth and technology transfer, reversing the colonial jet streams of debt and extraction. For those of us who are struggling in the most privileged bubbles on stolen land, making the invisible visible is a cosmic relief, and it's a call to action, to put the whole back into the story, to bring the whole world back into our narratives and back into our struggles, and to reawaken the generous offer of internationalism coming from our comrades in the rest of the world, to make common cause, to fight the same forces that oppress us all, and to join forces to fight for a genuinely global Green New Deal for everyone. The pandemic has been a terrifying and terrifyingly effective teacher. We know now, it is undeniable that we have the resources globally. We know that we're all connected. We know what and who is essential. So now we have to connect the dots and struggle together. There is a whole world and a whole story to be won. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Avi. And I think that point about, so many of the Green New Deal packages that have sort of emerged have rested on this understanding that things like renewable energy or renewable cars and simply replacing diesel cars with renewable cars will somehow not come at a global cost. And there's that reliance that the resources and the labor of the global south is still up for plundering and extraction. And that's really what we've tried to intervene and shake out of and bring to the surface that is being taken for granted when we have these conversations without an internationalist lens. So our next speaker, and just to remind you as well, before I go into that you can order the book for free or download a PDF of the book from the website www.global-gnd.com. You see some of you are asking the questions. So our next speaker is Kate Aronoff. She is the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and author of Overheated, How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. She is a staff writer at The New Republic, and her work has appeared in The Intercept, The New York Times, The Nation, Dissent, Rolling Stone, The Guardian, and many other outlets. And she tweets at Kate Aronoff. Kate, take it away.
Hello. Well, thank you so much to Dalia and everyone for organizing this panel, and just the collection is so incredible. And as someone from the U.S., it's not often that we unfortunately get to engage in truly global conversations, and so I'm just so grateful to have this, particularly as part of the conversation about a Green New Deal, which I am shocked whenever anybody outside the U.S. resonates with that frame, because it is so distinctly U.S. But I think Dalia framed it really well, which is that these frameworks for Green New Deal, often from the North, are really helping the North catch up in many ways with where the South has been. The Green New Deal, of course, has gone through many different iterations. It's been known as different things over the years. Was first, a demand from the South, right? A Marshall Plan for the Earth along similar lines. But I think to really underscore just why this intervention is so crucial, as we're thinking about the climate crisis, wanted to just ground the conversation a little bit in how badly equipped our global order, very sort of imperially structured global order is for dealing with this crisis. So just recently, last month, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change released a synthesis report sort of outlining the newly ramped up pledges from the countries which are signed on to the Paris Agreement. So 75 of the 191 countries which are signed on to this thing, which is the preeminent global compact by which we deal with this massive global problem, right? And so what it found in evaluating these new rampant pledges is that these countries were on course to emit 2.8% less than they would have before really recommitting themselves to taking on the climate crisis. This did not include the United States, did not include China, the two biggest emitters on the country in the case of the United States, which I'll talk about in a bit, which bears enormous historical responsibility for creating this crisis. And so, why is it that this thing which is supposed to guide our way out of the climate crisis is so bad at doing that? Why is it that we have this thing that was a major achievement in many ways, a grand sort of diplomatic achievement, but that is falling short by just about every measure? So I think you can look at that problem going back 20 years or so, right, to as long as the UNFCCC has been meeting. It's about 30 years old, give or take. And the US and other global north countries has at every sort of step along the way sought to really obscure ideas about historical responsibility and just how much the US owes to the rest of the world, right? So famously, the Kyoto Protocol was the sort of first draft of how we were going to deal with this problem on the international stage, and really outlined in ways that were not perfect the ways in which very wealthy countries had gotten their wealth through things that had fueled the climate crisis, and so owed it to the rest of the world not only to take on this crisis very quickly, to bring down their own emissions very quickly, but also to help fund the ability of other countries to pursue a path to low carbon development. And so that was going to be the sort of way we did that. And the US, not alone again, but our Senate, intervened to sabotage that process by making it so that the US could not sign on to a binding treaty. And so we've seen a sort of international responsible climate crisis circled around and orbited around the whims of the United States Senate, which is a tremendously undemocratic body from the perspective of ordinary people in the United States, and now has an enormous sway over how the world system deals with the climate crisis, right? And so in the wake of the collapse of Kyoto, we get the Paris Agreement, right, which is structured around these nationally determined contributions, as if every country were sort of navigating the climate crisis in our own little boats, compiling net zero pledges, so that we can all take this on. As we've seen, this is not working. This is not, the way we're going. But to understand just how poorly equipped that system is, I think we have to go back a little further, right? To understand why the UN has so few teeth in order to deal with this problem, to enforce pledges, right? To make sure that countries really are bringing down emissions, to really think about resource transfers, as Avi mentioned, from north to south, that we know are needed to deal with this crisis. And there was a point where that might not have been so obvious, right? So around the middle of the last century, as countries were winning their independence from colonialism, there was a real thought that the UN could be a body for global liberation, right? It could be a place where the ostensibly democratic representation of every country in the world joining this body could give way to a much more equal democratic order. Formations like the new international economic order, really sought to create a world system which was not structured along the lines of colonialism and imperialism. And part of the reason the Paris Agreement cannot do the things the Paris Agreement sets out to do is because that was defeated, and in no small part by the United States. There are other complicated reasons for it. That's a slightly simplistic definition. But the reason the Paris Agreement cannot do what it's supposed to do is a direct sort of consequence of imperialism. And I think, just points to, as many of the contributors do to this volume, to how much work has to be done to really rethink the international order, which was built, in many ways to protect imperial power, in no small part by the United States, and has created a system which is just so ill-equipped to deal with the climate crisis. Bodies like the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, which have just saddled, much of the South with debt, which has been such a constraint on countries' ability not only to pursue development on their own terms, but to pursue low carbon development, right, in the ways that many people have sought out. And so I think part of what a global Green New Deal has to do is to really think about a democratized global order, which is not people in the United States sort of mapping out a global Green New Deal, but to have that be a democratic conversation. I think this collection really sort of helps fill that out, right? What does it look like to actually have visions coming from different parts of the world? And what does it look like to think about real questions of resource transfers from the north to the south, as we know is so necessary. And I'll just end, I guess, a little bit by talking about how far that conversation has to go in the U.S., which might resonate a bit with folks in the U.K. But we've seen certainly in the last couple of years, but particularly since the Biden administration has taken over, a real shift in the way we think about climate politics, right? And so we had a climate denier in chief for 4 years. And this administration, the Biden administration, does not deny climate change. Is in many ways, thanks to movements, thanks to people really pushing from the grassroots, from many different places, is talking a much bigger game, is doing some things that we might want to see, but we still see this real firewall put between what is progressive domestic policy on climate and then foreign policy, which is still a sort of return to business as usual in the U.S., which means wars, it means foreign conflicts, it means militarized borders, it means all of the things that we do not want and which are incompatible with taking on the climate crisis. And I think empire being an empire in the U.S. really constrains even sort of well-meaning progressives' ability to think about what taking on this crisis might look like. And I think projects like this really help to expand our vision of what that means, which is, things like massive debt cancellation, really throwing the weight of the US around to, democratize the world order, to make, a real sort of bottom-up solutions to this crisis possible. I cannot overstate enough, just how sort of parochial a lot of the thinking about what climate action and even, to some extent a Green New Deal, what those visions can look like from the U.S. We cannot do in the U.S. the thing the U.S. is very good at doing, which is hinging prosperity, unequal prosperity within our own borders on exploitation and extraction abroad. Green New Deal, which does that, is not a Green New Deal which is worth its name. And I think that we just really need to be thinking much more holistically, as so many of the contributors to this volume do, about what it looks like to have a real internationalist approach to the climate crisis, which is still elusive among policymakers in the U.S., but I think is starting to sort of make its way into the sort of left edge of the conversation about what climate policy looks like here. And I'm just excited for this conversation and for the U.S. to catch up to the South.
Thank you so much, Kate. So our final speaker before we move on to questions is Harsha Walia. Harsha is author of Undoing Border Imperialism and Border and Rule, Global Migration, Capitalism, and the Rise of Racist Nationalism. She's organized across multiple feminist, anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-capitalist campaigns, including No One is Illegal and the Women's Memorial March and the Olympic Resistance Network. And she was recently appointed as Executive Director of the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, and she tweets at Harsha Walia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Congratulations on this book launch. It's such a gift to all of us. I'm here today on the lands of the Coast Salish people. These are the lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. And I think, of course, as others have mentioned, it's so imperative that when we're talking about a global Green New Deal, that central to that is land back, right? That there absolutely cannot be a global Green New Deal that doesn't contend with the historic and contemporary legacy of colonization and the jurisdiction of Indigenous nations to govern territory and resources in non-capitalist ways. And so I'm here in the context of Indigenous land, on Indigenous lands, and affirming Indigenous sovereignty, and really echoing, as others have said, how necessary it is for a global Green New Deal to be expansive, right? That we need to be talking about these core issues, and that the climate crisis really is a symptom. It's a symptom, a devastating symptom of ongoing colonialism, capitalism, and oppression all around the world. My comments here today, I was asked to speak on climate migration, the kind of connection between migration and border in the climate crisis, and what are some of the trends in responding to the climate crisis from the lens of displacement. And so I'll be commenting mostly on that, and really just wanting to echo what others have already said before, which is that, the roots of the climate crisis are not a result of humans not recycling enough or using too many plastic straws. It's this violent foundation that absolutely has to be transformed. And within that, climate-related displacement, or climate migration, if you will, is one of the world's fastest growing displacements, and in our current context, the largest refugee crisis that our planet has ever seen. And what that means is that almost one person every 1 to 2 seconds, that's 21.7 million people every year, every second, a person is being displaced as a result of climate. And that is 86% of all internal displacements today on the world, on the planet. And since 2016, new displacements that are caused by sudden onset climate disasters outnumber new displacements as a result of persecution by a ratio of 3 to 1. So that just gives you the scope of how urgent and, just the scope of climate-related displacement that we are contending with today. And of course, mirroring the climate crisis itself. While this is happening, the UN Convention, the UN Refugee Convention, the 1951 Convention, does not actually recognize climate-induced displacement. And there is no formal international protection or recognition for climate refugees who do manage to cross borders. Of course, the vast number of displaced people are what we call, what's in international circles known as internally displaced. But for the very few who do manage to cross borders, there's absolutely no protection. And, one example that I can give of that, there's so many, but one that is really close to me, and something that I was involved in for a long time in a campaign, was that of 2 Honduran men how we found out about, I'll start over. So how we found out, and I got to know these 2 men, these 2 cousins, was because there was a TV show in Canada called Border Security. And this TV show was a really shitty, cop type rerun show where instead of journalists being embedded, or producers being embedded in, with cops, they were embedded with border enforcement. And so one of the episodes that was about to air was of an immigration raid that took place on a construction site in Vancouver, where I live. And in the process of that raid, it was about to be televised. There was cameras everywhere. That's how people even knew this raid happened, right? Because it was being filmed as people were being handcuffed, being arrested, being asked about their immigration status, and going through the terror of immigration enforcement. And when these construction workers, all undocumented and migrant workers, were rounded up and put in an immigration detention center, their family members got in touch with me and many other organizers, and no one is illegal. And, let us know about this raid. And when we asked them, what's your story? What's the story of your family members? How did they come here? What we found out was that for 2 of the men in particular, they were from Honduras, and other men were from other parts of Mexico and Central America. But these 2 cousins in particular, they had fled Honduras because of the violence that their immediate family was facing, resisting Canadian mining interests, right? So Canada is the epicenter of the world's mining companies. 75% of the world's mining companies are actually based in Canada. We're a headquarter for mining capital and extraction, and particularly in Latin America, South and Central America. And so these two men, their family members, were involved in resistance to Canadian mining interests, specifically to Goldcorp in Honduras. And one of their family members was continuously harassed, and it was widely believed that their uncle had been assassinated by paramilitary organizations associated with Goldcorp, which is a Canadian mining company. And they fled. They fled for their lives. They came to Canada, again, one of the small proportion of people who managed to actually flee the country and make it to the global north. And when they got here, they received the very sage advice, which is that there is no way you can make a refugee claim saying that you are a climate refugee, that you are facing both political persecution as a family who is resisting Canadian mining, and also that you are facing climate-related devastation of your land, right? That you have lost your land and livelihood, because neither of those is going to be accepted. And above all, Canada is never going to accept and implicate itself in displacements around the world. So, they made up the tried, tested, true story of narco trafficking. And, they were found not to be credible. They became undocumented, and that's how they became detained. But really, in this one kind of experience and story, you see just the layers of complicity, the layers of global violence that the global north is implicated in, right? Both in terms of Canada's mining operations and then also the refusal of refugee status and protection to these two cousins. They were eventually deported despite a long campaign to try to protect all those who were picked up in that raid. But that show we did manage to get canceled and off the air. And this is, again, the reality for migrants, whether climate migrants or otherwise, every single day in countries around the world, right? This is not, of course, unique to Canada or the US. This is happening in the EU every single day. It's happening all around the world. And what's important to realize, of course, about climate displacements is that it's not just those sudden onset climate disasters that make the news. It's not just the floods. It's not just the fact that so much of the planet is burning. It's the compounding of long-term and ongoing displacements. And so if we look at countries like Bangladesh, as a low-lying deltaic plain on the largest river delta in the world, we know that Bangladesh is incredibly vulnerable, and particularly made vulnerable to climate-induced displacement. But it's not flooding or rising tides that will cause the majority of displacement in Bangladesh. It's actually the slow processes of deforestation, of soil erosion, of salinity intrusion, and crop failures. And these are the results of, long-standing patterns of neoliberalism, of neoliberal structural adjustment that has brought and vastly devastated the culture, the land-based livelihood of coastal communities, right? And forced monocultural production of rice and shrimp, for example, in Bangladesh. And so it's really important to understand that climate displacement cannot be separated from other forms of displacement. And there's a huge tendency in the climate movement to focus on climate-related displacement as if though that is somehow separate from and not metastasizing existing political and economic and social conflicts, right? So these are fundamentally bound up. And I think, what is we have to be really thoughtful about is that climate migration and migration generally is treated as like a recent phenomenon, even though genocide, displacement, and movement of millions of people has unequally structured our planet for at least 3 centuries, right? European immigrant settlers in the Americas and Oceanias were granted free land and became settlers, while the transatlantic slave trade from Africa and imported indentured labor from across Asia has actually underwritten the mass forced movement of people for centuries. And so when we talk about climate migration as new, or we talk about migration as new, we erase colonialism, right? Colonialism and imperialism is conveniently erased in the constitution of how we think of migration, in the same way that colonialism is often conveniently erased in how we imagine the climate crisis. We don't see these deep fault lines that are being exacerbated. And so it is really offensive when we see representations of climate migration that depicts climate migrants and refugees, or migrants and refugees in general, as the cause of a kind of imagined crisis at the border, right? We hear this all the time, the refrain of our border is in crisis, there's a caravan, there's a flood, there's a surge, when in fact, actually mass migration is the outcome of the actual crises of capitalism, conquest, and climate change. And so when we're thinking about, how do we respond through the framework of a Green New Deal and a global Green New Deal around climate migration, around climate displacement, I think we have to be cautious about a few things. And I think one is we have to be really cautious about how climate is increasingly becoming weaponized as a tool of economic imperialism. And we see this most starkly in the case of land grabbing, right? Green grabs, which is, essentially the appropriation of land and resources for environmental agendas, such as conservation or biocarbon sequestration and biofuel production. And land grabbing in the name of environmental protection has a long history in conservationist efforts, but really is escalating, particularly right now with land grabbing by agribusinesses, right? So land grabs by agribusinesses have acquired over 2% of the world's entire arable land, really focused on the continent of Africa. So I think we really have to counter green grabbing as a so-called environmental solution alongside other techno solutions that are being challenged because it's driving displacement. We also have to push back against growing eco-fascism. Eco-fascism is the tendency to call for increased militarization of the border to protect kind of scarce environmental resources like food and water in the north from refugees and migrants. And, this is really escalating and really urgent because, the Christchurch white nationalist killer, the El Paso white supremacist killer, both cited environmental decay in their manifestos, right? So the Christchurch killer railed about how, quote unquote, continued immigration into Europe is environmental warfare. And in El Paso, the El Paso killer declared, quote, if we can get rid of enough people, then our way of life can become more sustainable. And so these kinds of eco-fascist theories that blame population growth, immigration, and high birth rate for environmental degradation and food scarcity are on the rise. And the underlying logic of this kind of white nationalism is to use and weaponize environmentalism and the myth of human carrying capacity, never implicating corporate devastation and capitalism, to argue for ethnic cleansing and border securitization. And so we see more and more the rise of these kind of masculinist, white nationalist savior ideologies where saving the pure race really merges with kind of guarding a fragile earth, right? So these kind of the seamless connection in eco-fascism. And in Europe, we're seeing too Marine Le Pen, who's attempting to make a comeback by campaigning on ecological localism, where immigrants are compared to foreign invasive species in her new propaganda. And her party is now putting forward that, quote, borders are the environment's greatest ally. It is through them that we will save the planet, end quote. So we really need to be cautious and reject eco-fascism within environmental movements. And a global Green New Deal gives us a pathway to rejecting that because it gives us a map for internationalism that rejects the global apartheid that separates the so-called global north from the so-called global south. The last thing that I think we need to be tending to and thinking about in the context of a global Green New Deal is really refusing the turn towards labor migration. And a number of climate organizations actually endorsed the Global Compact for Migration. The Global Compact for Migration is a fairly new UN agreement on a global approach to all forms of migration. But it's incredibly problematic, not only because it's a weak UN agreement as UN instruments go, but because one of its central principles is to facilitate labor mobility by creating mobility schemes of basically temporary labor migration. And temporary labor migration is essentially our new era of indentureship, where migrants are commodities, and labor migration is increasingly being pushed by certain climate NGOs as a climate adaptation strategy. And they don't actually deal with at all the fundamental question of racial capitalism, right? Which is that to use migrants and to treat them as commodities, to make them expendable, to treat them as indentured labor, where they can be used by capital interests and then deported and racially scapegoated and terminated from their employment. These programs are fundamentally racist. They treat migrants as commodities, and millions of migrants around the world are basically treated as expendable in the same way that land, air, and water is treated as expendable by the corporate elite who are digging up and polluting our planet. And so it is so important that in these three ways, in terms of eco-fascism, temporary labor migration, and green grabbing, that the global Green New Deal really think about the deep inequities of global apartheid, really think about the implication of what it means to put forward climate solutions that really entrench and further capitalism and imperialism. And instead, we think about the global Green New Deal, which is what's so amazing about this book, which is that, you know, we actually don't think of the global Green New Deal simply as a climate policy, right? It is so much more than a climate policy. It is about teaching us another way to live. And I think that's what's so extraordinary about the possibility of a global Green New Deal, is that its fundamental potential lies in fundamentally transforming how we live. And that we're thinking about and connecting the dots between abolishing police and prisons to climate policy, that we're thinking and advocating vociferously for ending all imperialist wars and militarization that devastate people's lands and livelihood, that we are ending a capitalist economic system that places all that is sacred onto the market for profits, that we are fully respecting the self-determination of indigenous nations, that we are fully ending imperialism and global apartheid, that we are valuing and upholding care work, which we know is disproportionately gendered care work. And I think that is what is so revolutionary and visionary about a global Green New Deal, is its internationalism, is that it is radical, that it is green, that it is red. And I'll end with the words of the late, great Eduardo Galeano, who used to say, quote, "Indignation must always be the answer to indignity. Reality is not destiny." And we know that we are at a tipping point with the climate crisis. But if we remember that our reality is not destiny, if we remember that every time that we struggle, when we organize, when we demand what seems the impossible, then we have the possibility of winning, then we can carry the struggle forward. And so again, I just want to close with the words of Eduardo Galeano when he tells us that our reality is not our destiny, and the possibility of a global Green New Deal as emancipatory, as liberatory, as freedom for all people really is what is so exciting about this book. So thank you all for producing this book and for offering it to all of us for free. And if everyone listening has not yet downloaded it, please do. It's available for free at that website that's on your screen right now. Thank you all.
Thank you. We've had many different questions. We won't be able to get to them all today, but we hope to be able to continue this conversation going forward. One of the questions that hopefully groups together a few that have appeared on the thread that I'm going to start by trying to answer and then pass on to Avi, Jale and Kate to come in with their responses relates to this idea of what are green jobs? How do we create them? Can they be created in the global south? And how does the idea of creating green jobs contend with the need for degrowth and the idea that growth is an essential component of imperialism, so degrowth has to be an essential component of anti-imperialist response. So very quickly, this is a question that we try to address in one of our opening chapters in the publication on work. Companies like Tesla and Glencore would see themselves as creating green jobs when in fact they are replicating a system not only of workers' rights oppression within their supply chain, but also being among the highest polluters, highest emitting polluters. And so what we need to reclaim in this story of what is a green job is a kind of degrowth articulation of jobs that expend energy to create a good life. So that's what we need to do to be able to meet the target of 1.5 degrees. And that's really important because up to 2 billion lives, more lives, will be exposed to climate events at 2 degrees compared to 1.5 degrees. So if we're serious about meeting the 1.5 degree target, we need to be really clear about the green jobs we want to expend energy on. And fortunately, if you are inspired by the story that we're telling today, then that energy is needed for food, for housing, for care work, for education, for living a good life. And that's in the articulation that we put forward in the book, consistent with an anti-imperialist degrowth concept of green jobs. But having had a very initial attempt at answering that really big question, I'll pass on to Kate, Avi, and Jale if one of you want to just unmute and come in. And then Dalia will ask perhaps 1 or 2 more questions before we close today, hopefully no later than 10 minutes late. Jale, yes.
Thank you, Harpreet, and thank you for the question. I think for me, coming from the global south and from the Pacific, the issue is not really, what makes a green job important. For me, basically what you have mentioned, the question really should be targeted at how do we ensure that the jobs that we create under this new transformed economy that we are thinking of is equitable, is dignified. A green new job, like for us here in Fiji, if it's still built on the minimum pay rate of per hour of Fiji $2.68, which is still less than $1.50 US, it's not worth it. I think the issue really needs to be looked at. We really need to look at the underlying systems that drives the way that we think regarding development, and that needs to be addressed first before we even start talking about the colors of the jobs that we need to be putting through. For me, having a dignified, equitable job that respects and recognize the worth that individual puts through. So we're talking about the working conditions, the kind of pay that they get, the kind of social safety nets that are associated with that. I think that is the conversation that that we should be having. Thank you.
Go ahead, Kate.
Oh, sure. Yeah, just quickly. I mean, I think in the US in particular, there's an idea of a green job as something which is like the green version of like post-war prosperity, right? And so there's this idea that like we'll have people going to the factory and putting on their hard hats, white men mostly, and bringing home a family-sustaining wage, and that can be sort of subbed out and green, and they're building solar panels instead of cars, or electric vehicles instead of internal combustion vehicles, and that I think there is some role, right, for building solar panels, for building wind turbines, all of that, but I think it's a relatively small piece of the sort of whole picture of what a green job looks like. I mean, we know we have a lot of green jobs in the US, and our economy revolves more around work that is generally low carbon, right? So things like teaching, nursing, these already low carbon, predominantly unionized professions, which are doing green work and doing more of the thing that we would want to see, right? On the other end of a Green New Deal, which is not pumping out widgets, whether those are like Teslas or wind turbines or whatever, but that is actually caring for the planet in the way that we want, caring for one another, and sort of settling into a sort of slower groove. We can't go back to in the U.S. for many, many reasons, but we can't go back to like 1955. I mean, that was not a paradise for a lot of people in this country, and particularly was not great for the rest of the world, right? That was premised on a lot of extraction abroad, on cheap oil, on all these things we really don't want to return to. So I think it's worth rethinking some of the kind of mid-century imaginary that can come along with with talking about a Green New Deal and thinking about, you know, what is actually a new social contract that we need to build, which looks quite different than what created, you know, what's known as post-war prosperity. And, you know, think about what we actually need, right? Which is, you know, a lot of care for the elderly, a lot of, you know, care for children, to be really rethinking our relationship with the natural world, and doing things like remediating coastlines, all these things which are not particularly profitable, right? If we, you know, hold green jobs, if we think about green jobs as things which the private sector will create, they won't do it, right? We know that the private sector is not terribly interested in doing things that are good for the planet. And so those need to be jobs which in many cases will happen through the public sector, and will be public sector jobs, which in the US at least have been the sort of steady source of employment for women, for people of color, providing, you know, well-paid work, and doesn't involve sort of going back to this, you know, pretty revanchist idea of what work is or should be. And I think, you know, we should be doing less work as well. To throw that in there, and not, you know, sort of striving for something which existed in a horribly unequal way 60 years ago.
Questions are combined, because I think the question of jobs, like the question of growth, is right up the alley of the system we're trying to deconstruct. We're talking about work, and we're talking about building a society based on a completely different set of values. And so measuring things in this mechanized way around jobs is part of the problem. And as a bunch of us have said, seeing the connective tissue of the economy, which is human, which is about care work, this is climate work. And it's dignified work, it's essential work, and it's work that is currently degraded, devalued, and the site of extraction, and needs to be the kind of work that is put at the heart of what we value. And what we compensate in society. But that doesn't mean, it's still, when we're talking about jobs, we're still talking about what people get paid. And in the current arrangements, obviously that's incredibly important. But there are other ways to value the intersectional work of care, and the provision of universal public services and status for all people in the economy is maybe more urgent in many countries, rich and poor alike. Where we don't have, I mean, the pandemic once again has lit up what we already knew, but cast it in horrific terms of mass suffering and death. When you don't have a functioning public health system that can reach every part of the land, when you don't have those institutions that serve everybody equally, then every crisis plays out along the same fault lines that we've been naming. So this question of growth and job growth is, I think, in some ways using the terms of the system that we're intent on deconstructing, but it's an illuminating way to think about it. The work of care is also the work of protecting the land. And that important statistic that came out of a recent UN research and traditional knowledge, that 85% of the world's biodiversity is on land which indigenous peoples are protecting, are defending against industrial development. This is the work that is actually happening, the work that is preserving the possibility for a safe future for all people. That's the kind of work that has to be incorporated in all of our talk about just transition, about a global Green New Deal.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to pose the next question to Harsha and Tina. And I know, Jale, you might have to leave, but if you are around, then we can hear from you as well after Harsha and Tina, because I'd be really interested to hear what you have to say. So knowing their limitations, how should our movements from around the world respond to existing international climate negotiations? Should we be responding to them at all? And that connects to a couple of other questions that we had, which includes from Katie, that colonial power persists in global economic governance institutions. Obviously, transforming that is vital to the Global Green New Deal. Love to hear your thoughts on how we can challenge this, and ideas of how that radical energy can be revived, especially thinking in the UK as we move towards negotiations in Glasgow. So, Tina, would you be up for responding to that first?
Sure. So, there are multiple issues with the international climate negotiations, not least as accessibility by Indigenous groups who are, you know, impacted first and often worst in these issues. And we often can get caught up in those international climate negotiations. One of the things that we need to be responding with, as Avi has really eloquently pointed out, is talking about the truth of the structure, the truth of the system, the complicitness of these institutions, who often, they utilize paternalism, which is just another form of colonialism, right? Paternalism is still this assumption of this hierarchical assumption of values and power and worth, and it's being applied in a way that they believe is good intent. But paternalism is just costumed colonialism at the end of the day. And so, you know, the truth of the complicitness of these bodies of power needs to be laid bare, and we need to be having that discussion so that we can start to plot a path towards justice, really, and clearly define who the players are, what their underlying ideologies have been, you know, what's the history of that system, what's the legacy of and the remnants of that system still in the decision making that's being played out today in these international institutions. There's still an overarching assumption that the institutions come with an open heart and good intent. That's not always the case. More often than not, there's still an extreme level of self-interest, even within these nation states. The United Nations is a collection of colonial and colonizing governments that is still, you know, largely driven with these ideas of maintaining those colonial power systems as well. And so when we get caught up too much in those systems, it takes away from the very important work that we need to be doing on the ground, even just to protect ourselves from the very real, current, happening right now impacts of the climate crisis. And so, you know, I think we really need to be balancing our, you know, our voice is needed in that space, and our voice is needed to, first and foremost, I think, call out the complicitness within the harm. But then we also need to be focusing on developing solutions on the ground in our own communities. And then the other space is also for us as Indigenous peoples to have a supported space where we come together for our own united Indigenous nations to make, you know, so that our voices are not restricted down to these 3-minute time slots, who are then reinterpreted by other people and then placed into acceptable, you know, sanitized versions of recommendations for a general assembly of colonizing nations to make their mind up about whether or not these ideas work for them or not. You know, that's not justice. And so, you know, other things that need to happen include our own independent, united space for not just Indigenous peoples, but marginalized peoples as well, and peoples who have been dislocated or dispossessed, and yeah, come together to forge solutions and to also discuss just the injustice of that power system. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tina. Harsha, do you have any final responses to that?
Yeah, I would just echo what Tina has already said, and others have said. I guess I can take on maybe the piece of the question that's not specific to the climate negotiations, but the second part of that, which is, so colonial power persists in global economic governance institutions like the WTO, IMF, World Bank, etc. How we challenge this, and I think, you know, it's a really important question, because I think increasingly, as at the international level, and the arenas have become so diffuse, and there are so many, you know, multilateral, bilateral conversations, so many UN tables, it becomes easy to forget these kind of core institutions like the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank. And I think it's so important that we squarely do challenge them. Like, even the question, how can we challenge them? I think the first step is to challenge them. I think our movements have really lost the internationalist analysis of these institutions. And here I'm thinking to, you know, the 1990s and the early 2000s, where if you were part of social movements, you knew what these institutions were, you know how free trade agreements work, you understand structural adjustment programs. But I don't think that's necessarily the case in terms of global consciousness, particularly in the North. Of course, in the South, you know, people are living the impacts of structural adjustment every day. But we don't often link kind of local austerity to global austerity in the same way that we used to. And so I think it is so important that we challenge these institutions by even knowing about them, by challenging their power, challenging their legitimacy, and of course, really highlighting how they continue to maintain global imperial capitalist power, right? So when people are we're given this refrain of post-colonial, that we live in a post-colonial world, we absolutely don't, right? Colonialism has not ended in many forms, especially, of course, colonialism in relationship to indigenous nations captured by nation states. And also, states in the global south are not independent from the global north in terms of these ongoing dynamics of extraction and domination. And so part of it has to be clarity on our vision of them, which is that they need to be abolished. They cannot exist. They cannot have legitimacy. And especially right now, where we're seeing so many countries in the global south who at the WTO are fighting back against vaccine apartheid, for example. Yet, countries in the global north continue to hoard and maintain intellectual property over vaccines at the expense of the global south, right? Which is another form of imperialism and apartheid in the making as we speak. And so I think it really behooves us to understand these institutions and to challenge them and to demand that they cease to exist.
Thank you so much, Harsha, and thank you to all of our speakers. The comment section is absolutely alight with questions. Unfortunately, we're going to have to end there because I think these events after an hour and a half, I think that's a good time. But as we mentioned before, this is really a sort of attempt to open up and actually continue a lot of conversations that have already been happening for several decades. And we really hope that this book can be a resource for people who are looking to think about how we can connect these dots, connect these themes, connect these movements in order to come up with alternative ways of doing internationalism and ways of doing internationalism that really puts the empowerment and the anti-colonial spirit at its heart. So thank you once again to all of our speakers. The event this evening has been recorded and it will be available on the World Transforms YouTube channel. So that's The World Transformed. If you just search that on YouTube, you should find it. Just a reminder that the book comes with an accompanying website where you can read the book online, you can download a PDF, and you can also put in an order for a free copy of the book. You can order up to 5 copies of the book through the website. If you want to order more, for example, for a library, or you want to disseminate it amongst, a reading group or the movement that you're organizing in or your local community, then you can there's an email address on the website where you can email for an inquiry for a larger order. So once again, thank you so much to The Leap. Thank you to Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, and thank you to the World Transformed, and thank you to our speakers and to the contributors of this incredible book. We are so excited to be able to share this work with you now, and we hope that everyone who has been at this event will really enjoy reading it and share and spread the word amongst your local communities. Thank you so much.